Fringeelements made the claim in the last video response to me that social breeding does have an effect on how successful you are. He makes the claim that if two ambitious people breed, their children are more likely to be ambitious. He shows his limited understanding of both neurology and genetics. The amount of breeding and inbreeding required to cause significant beneficial effects in your genetic predisposition in terms of traits like ambition would require thousands of years of evolution. A new trait like ambition has not had the time to develop, as it's such a complex trait caused by a huge variety of factors the psychologists barely understand, especially if it was ambition that actually helped the species. I always wish I could invent a drink that would give me willpower. I'd be the richest man alive for multiple reasons. This nuance and confusion in terms of genetic traits is one of the reasons researchers have begun using dogs to spot gene traits, because their traits are caused by massive inbreeding and diseases that are highly ambiguous in our own gene structure, but are loud and clear in dog genomes. An advanced benefit in genes is very slow to occur in one generation. However, a defect in genes can be passed on fairly easily. Dr. Robert Hare wrote a book called Snakes in Suits: When Psychopaths Go to Work. It discusses the huge number of sociopaths in powerful positions. A sociopath is someone with insufficient mirror neurons. Mirror neurons allow them to feel empathy for anyone around them. A sociopath is great, however, at manipulating others because the person does not let empathy get in the way of what they want. Most of these ambitious people he is discussing are sociopaths. And many sociopaths are stockbrokers, CEOs, and politicians. Empathy is what defines us as humans and has allowed our communication and bonding that has allowed us to work together and do great things. Unfortunately, that empathy can be used against us by the outlying sociopaths who use our empathic cues to manipulating us into trusting them. Psychological evaluations used to identify a sociopath, labeled as personality tests, were sent around to the type of people Fringeelements considers ambitious, mainly stockbrokers and CEOs, and a stunning amount of them came back positive for being a high-functioning sociopath. These sociopaths do well for themselves in the short term, but over a long term it is the people who are guarded but help others and have empathy for others that do best. An example of this is in Richard Dawkins' documentary using game theory called Nice Guys Finish First. I was trying to find out his area of expertise and found his blog post where he shows a study that IQ is hereditary, because he shows a study where identical twins, even when separated at birth, tend to have IQs close to each other around 70% of the time. This is very interesting, of course. However, it does not discuss the effects of epigenetics nor the impacts of social stigmas, nor should it. It would be beyond the scope of the study. The twins were born from the same woman under the same nutritional and stress conditions, causing their genes to express quite similarly. To say this indicates hereditary of IQ is a complete misunderstanding of epigenetics and gene expression, however. There is as much genetic variation in the brain in any ethnic group. However, if that ethnic group is subject to high levels of stress and malnutrition, you will see a much lower level of expression of genes in forms of intelligence and higher in terms of survivalist genes. Who needs to waste energy on nuanced brain when you need to struggle to stay alive? An interesting side note is that in the early 1900s, the statistics showed that Jews scored lower on all tests on average than whites and were therefore inferior. However, now, other than in the KKK, that stigma has been destroyed by many affluent and intellectual Jews. Sadly, if your skin color is that noticeable and reviled, it is really hard to dodge a stigma no matter how you act or try to hide your ethnicity, like many Jews actually ended up doing. If someone even tries to make the claim that the Holocaust fixed that because it caused survival of the fittest, they don't really have the first clue about natural or artificial selection. If anything is even close to being true about this in terms of intelligence, the Holocaust selected for Jews that have better stress coping, and that's about it. Majority of what the Holocaust did is it selected for people who were better at coping and reproducing after a long period of stress and malnutrition. which really doesn't have anything to do with intelligence. Also, great scientists like Einstein never went through the camp. And there were many intelligent Jews before the Nazi concentration camps. On top of that, IQ tests have been shown to have a bias toward whites, in that language and examples it uses are much more familiar to whites than other minorities. When rephrased to show examples more familiar to the minority, they do better. If you want to know how stress affects gene expression, please read Robert Sapolsky's book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. He cites sources directly from scientific papers, and there's around 3 to 4 scientific papers per page in many cases. If you've never done research with scientific journals, that's a major feat. Now lastly, we come to the effects of social stigmas on IQs. If you haven't yet, please watch the last video I did discussing gays and the brown-eyed, blue-eyed experiment. Along with this study, another was done that is pretty eye-opening about social stigmas. Claude M. Steele wrote a book called Whistling Vivaldi. In it, he discussed the major yet subtle effects of social bias on an individual. He named the book such because he found, as a big scary black man, if he whistled Vivaldi around white people, they were put at ease because he now seemed more educated and more like them. Unfortunately, social bias and racial bias are naturally ingrained into us because of the us versus them mentality. It's advantageous, but unfortunately it gets in the way of us binding together as a community. One of the major studies his book shows is one where they gave a math test to women. Many minorities and women are stigmatized as being less capable of being good at math than white or Asian men. They were given another test of the exact same difficulty, but before the test, the proctor said, "I know women aren't as good as math as men, but the way this test was written, this test has shown women actually do better than men." Same test difficulty, and the women scored significantly higher. A study showed a group of illiterate black teens who could not read no matter how much the teachers tried, had them learn Chinese characters, and they picked it up like a sponge in an afternoon, and they could read very simple sentences. The problem was that the women in these teens had what is called in psychology learned helplessness, when the brain goes, no matter what I do, I still won't be good, so why bother? These areas of the brain are actually discouraged from learning, so they stay dormant and don't grow, even though they're perfectly capable of it. The teens didn't have negative memories associated with reading Chinese, just while reading English, so there were no mental blocks for this type of information. Sadly, these problems persist when people meet the self-fulfilling prophecy enforced on them, because it just proves to the bigots that their prejudice is valid, allowing them to cause the cycle to continue to the next generation. Mind you, the culture and group of a student may have had effects on each other, and part of their group identity may have been the inability to read. So kids who could have read may have created learned helplessness because they knew if they did learn, they would have no longer been accepted. Fringeelements makes important points about black culture, however, criticism of blacks seems to be his only method of trying to help them. Criticism without trying to get to know them or understand them just makes a person sound disconnected and prejudiced. As a teacher and a tutor with my students, I have to get on their level, listen to them, and get to know them and their misunderstandings and flaws in their knowledge so I can correct them. After that, I can critique, not criticize their techniques. If criticism was my only way of teaching someone who didn't get what I was talking about, let's just say half my class would have failed, and I would have just walked away from the class with a self-righteous pride that I was just genetically better than them and worked harder than them. They were just bad students, as he called many of the people in his last video. Epigenetic study shows that poor, stressed parents have children with lower IQs as cortisol causes genes to express much differently. Higher vocabulary used directly with a child also raises IQ, and if your parents are too busy raising your other siblings or working 5 jobs, and they never learn much in the way of higher vocabulary, the cycle of low IQ will continue to go on. Fringeelements has posted on his blog a list of ways blacks get away with calling you racist, but if you say that about whites, it's not racist, and why whites have disadvantages in areas that blacks can skate free from. Tooltime recently made 2 videos discussing white pride, which I highly recommend you to watch. Many things said about blacks that you could easily say about whites are racist because that phrase carries with it centuries of prejudice and generalization. Whereas if you make the same statement about a white person, you know it's not discussing a race, it's just discussing that person or that subgroup of persons. Whites have had the power, and when some white person in power says something about an entire minority, that's racist. On top of that, changing the language is made to reduce the effects caused by generations of stigma. If we say something to criticize a white person, nothing being said about it is assumed that your problem exists because you're white. The ties to our language and culture at this point in time still has the assumption that certain insults are making the nuanced assertion that the person's problem is because they're black and inferior. Give it a few decades and hopefully we can get over this. I added a link in the bottom about a black principal who said that white teachers aren't qualified to teach black children. This is racist. Why? Because the principal had the power and used his prejudice over white people. Actual abuse of power, not the power of accusing you of racism, is when blacks will have what is dubbed as reverse racism, that has any real effect on white people other than hurting their feelings. Of course, now I'm having problems making sure I said this in a way that covers all the bases and doesn't skip on something I know and leaving it out, which will give him a way to take something I said and twist it. I've learned some interesting arguments that I'd never heard from in his videos, but he has also taken phrases I've said and massively twisting them to mean something I never said. It's also really easy to attack someone and make them look like an idiot when you aren't actually attacking their points, just arguing straw men. However, I will end with this. Genetics being the effect on why many blacks are still poor is no longer on the table at all for the exact same reason that creationism is no longer on the table. The evidence is not there at all. There are even more studies I never even touched on that can't even fit in one video. But I hope this will raise awareness. Psychology and biology are not fringe elements' friends in this case. Hopefully they will be if he can accept his own ignorance caused by his lack of time and energy to actually study these topics, not because he's stupid, and change with the new evidence.